welcome to the second deep dive LEHI alumni webinar. I should say good day, Vandals. Great to have you back. We know there's a lot of special sessions and so forth going on, so this is being recorded for folks to come in and watch later. It's a 90-minute session. Each speaker will have about 10 minutes to share some thoughts from their perspective on the topic today, and then there'll be 3 or 4 minutes for Q&A. If you have a question during the presentation on a PowerPoint deck slide, please go ahead and put that in the chat, and I will work it into the presentation to them when there's a place to do that. And also, I just want to share that depending on where we're at with participants as far as legislators go at the breakout sessions, we may stay together with one group, or we may go ahead and do the breakout depending on how many folks are online at that time. So we're going to just kind of roll with what's going to work best for the small group discussions, and then the group debrief will be at the end after the small group discussion. The session today is on distribution system planning. You know, most of you, depending on when you went through the LEHI program, probably had different exposures to distribution system planning, DER planning. And it's obviously one of the most critical things happening today is that planning and procurement process looking at the distribution system. We have 3 excellent speakers for you today to give you 3 different perspectives about what the best practices are from their deployment of planning. As more and more resources are coming to bear behind the meter, how those are going to integrate with utility is going to be really important to make sure that there's resource adequacy, resource flexibility, all those things that used to be delivered top down have to be looked at from the bottom up in today's rapid build out of edge computing and the Internet of Things. I just was in a discussion yesterday talking about some of the fuse boxes I know we have coming to market. They're going to have Bluetooth built into the fuse, and load management is going to be part and parcel within the home energy management system, using the fuse box in that way. And where I'm going with this is that one of the things that need to be sorted out in the distribution system between utilities and what's going on behind the meter is, what areas of law are those things going to be written in? Are you going to have that in the building codes? Are you going to have things like what security is in the building codes? Is that going to go into the public consumer law where most of the Internet of Things go, or is it going to be written to utility code? All that has to be also figured out, but doing that is going to be a result of good planning processes that give you some way to visualize what DERs are going to be bought at what type of uptake rate. And that's what this panel is about, is to give you some visibility into the thinking and what folks are looking for in trying to figure that question out. The takeaways today are going to be how new technologies and resources on the distribution grid, such as solar energy storage, are changing the way the power system is managed. What steps can legislators take to help create a regulatory structure that promotes innovative and cost-effective solutions? And how do state policies influence the development of distribution energy resources? I'm going to go right into our first speaker today. We have Damian Sciano, who's the Director of Distributive Resource Integration at Con Edison. He oversees the company's evolving distribution system implementation plan called a DSIP, Distribution Service Platform, which is DSP, and designed to integrate distributive energy resources. He has over 30 years of utility experience developing cogeneration projects for Trigen Energy, as well as working in power generation. He served as an assistant professor at Columbia University, where he teaches power systems analysis. He's a professional engineer in the state of New York and holds an MBA from finance from Baruch College and a doctorate degree from New York Polytechnic School of Engineering. Let's give a warm LEHI virtual Vandal welcome to Damian Sciano from Con Edison. Thank you, Damian. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Jeff. Really appreciate that. Happy to be here. So I'll kick it off as the utility person to talk about kind of the framework and our clean energy future and the future of the electric grid. Hopefully you can see my slides, and as I'm trying to advance them, here we go. So my agenda, and I'm starting the clock now to make sure I stay on time. I felt like you had to have a little bit of the landscape in the New York City and Westchester layout. I'll talk about the distributed system platform, which Jeff just mentioned is a huge enabler to this. We'll talk about grid modernization. and some closing thoughts. And I would say, the three things I hope I convey and that you walk away with is, the first one, Moore's law does not apply to everything. As amazing as computers and technology is, it sometimes is limited in infrastructure and things like that. So to use the example of a house, you've got to decide whether you're renovating it, and dramatically improving it with smart sensors and solar and batteries and things like that, or knocking it down and building it from scratch. So I think in New York State, for reasons I'll expound on a little bit more in a minute, we've kind of decided that it's a renovation. So that's point number one. Moore's law doesn't apply to everything, but how do you leverage it where it does? The second point I'd like to make is storage. You literally cannot get enough energy storage on the system, and it's got to come from, I think it's got to come from a spectrum of places, starting, from the customer to the utility, right to the bulk storage system. And then the third piece that I hope comes across very clear is, Con Edison wants to be a leader in this field. We recognize that the customer is the only reason that we exist, and facilitating this and being responsive to the customers and giving them the green energy future that they want and deserve is paramount to everything that we do. So I'll dive right into that. I tried to keep the kind of commercial short just to who we are. Right. So if you look on the left side of the screen, you'll see mostly New York State, and the blue area, which is what's important for this, the Con Edison regulated company, not our sister company, Orange and Rockland, which you see in the orangish colors. We make up about 1% of the state's geography, but we're about 33% of the electric usage. So very dense infrastructure, as you know, most of you have probably visited or at least aware of it. 3.4 million electric customers, and we have a summer peak of about 13.2 gigawatts. Okay, that's where we're talking about. And I guess the other key point here is that just because of natural boundaries, the Atlantic Ocean here on the south, the Sound here on the east, and then the Hudson River on the west, New York City is a classic load pocket, which is how the T&D engineers like to refer to it. So we have a tremendous amount of in-city generation. It's actually a requirement we learned after the 1977 blackout, where the lightning took out a couple of the overhead lines coming into New York City. So resiliency has been a passion of ours for a while, and having that in-city generation is critical. So as we retire that and change it over to greener energy that might be coming from other places, that's where energy storage, just something's got to replace it inside that load pocket. So reason number one, I love energy storage. The REV landscape is what started us out in 2015. That was focusing on greening New York State. It had some pretty significant renewable goals, and it was intended to be kind of market driven, open up the marketplace, stop building the T&D system, and things will kind of take care of themselves. And there was even some early questions whether the grid would even survive or not, or it would go kind of like wireless telecommunication with rooftop solar and batteries. But the CLCPA kind of puts the pedal to the metal. I would say REV had us driving cross country to California. CLCPA has us taking a jet to Hawaii. So they're both in the same direction, but you're going to get, they're a lot faster. CLCPA, full decarbonization. It's actually a law, not an order. And it does focus on transmission and large scale renewables, in addition to the DER marketplace, which is still super important. So kind of just getting here and trying to transition to the distributed energy resource, and the stuff on the right side of this graph, which I know is what we want to talk about. Here's the classic central plant paradigm. It's called, you generate it far away, you transmit it, you distribute it, and then obviously the customer uses it. And you can see from REV, I've tried to lay it out, most of the emphasis was on expanding the energy efficiency, which Con Ed has already been doing for decades, enabling the DER marketplace, that's kind of new to REV, building that distributed system platform that's going to be the people, process, and technologies to make all of this happen, data sharing so customers can make better informed decisions, and so can vendors, utilizing non-wire solutions. I know some people call them non-wires alternatives to try to avoid traditional builds. And then REV did have some focus on electric vehicles. And it had a mention of large scale renewables, but that was track 3 out of 3. So again, it wasn't that they didn't recognize it. It was a little bit less emphasized. CLCPA, we've got RFPs already in place for offshore wind. We've got aggressive goals for energy storage. It's much more focused on that side. But then even on the distribution side, more of the distributed system platform and expand electrification beyond just transportation, i.e. electric vehicles, but to electrification of heating. And again, in the Moore's law doesn't apply everywhere. Very early in REV, it became clear that the grid was not going to be an impediment to this, but was going to be the most important enabler to it. And you know, I don't love the term smart grid because the current grid today is fairly smart. It's got incredible material science, reliability, et cetera, and so on. But it's kind of a set it and forget it, you know. And the fossil fuel plants, as bad as they are for the environment, are dispatchable assets and very easy to kind of run. The intermittent resources are much more dynamic and require a lot of things happening on the grid. And you're managing, instead of dozens of things, you're managing thousands and hundreds of thousands. So the grid has to, it's got to be modernized, but it has to be much more dynamic. That I think is the key point. So the first thing we did for REV was build a distributed system platform. I know this is a very busy slide, but I'll go through it quick. You know, we look at it as integrating renewables and storage into the planning, the operations, and to a large extent, creating a market. We're already past the short-term focus. In fact, I changed the titles to these. You know, so we've done the data sharing on a kind of primitive basis, right? We got our interconnection is much better. We've got hosting capacity maps. We've just issued electric vehicle hosting capacity maps. We're going to go to energy storage hosting capacity maps. And so now that's all in this umbrella of data sharing that covers everything from, you know, customer level to grid level stuff. We're building a DERM system, you know, to go beyond just managing demand response, where you're shutting off lights and equipment, to where you're actively dispatching and curtailing all sorts of distributed energy resources. The grid operations, the monitoring and control, you can see the table goes a little bit like this, right? That's developing a little bit after the planning, because we needed the planning as a foundation. And then we've been setting up the marketplace all along and trying to create value streams for these different resources. And all of this is built on us expanding out our AMI, so we got a lot more data, giving the customer a better digital experience, maintaining cybersecurity, and then building a GIS system and a customer solution system that's going to be kind of the groundwork for a DERM system. And electric vehicles recently in an order just kind of became like a foundational infrastructure for us. We've got what should amount to between $300 million to $400 million to help enable the charging infrastructure in New York City and Westchester for electric vehicles. All right, watching the time. Okay, so non-wire solutions, we target them at the area substation. It requires us to have all sorts of a portfolio approach. And so I was just kind of highlighting that, but I think I'm going to gloss over that quickly. We can answer questions on that. And grid mod, you know, we went from that top category where we used to focus on reliability, safety, and clean energy. And we were decarbonizing from, you know, coal to oil to gas and then to nuclear. But now it's about reliability and resiliency, as we see because of the climate change. It's about safety and security, you know, still having some kind of microgrid power or something like that, or at least some places that people can go to when you do have these fairly rare outages, and then flexibility to take customer clean energy as well as the grid. We've modernized our network protector relays to take two-way power flow. We're putting smart sensors across our system to understand and keep a pulse on that system. And we've already got one energy storage in place. It's a modest but really impressive 2 megawatt facility over in Queens. And we're in the process of building 2 more and certainly with many more to come. So here I've just very quickly shown a picture of our grid. Because we are in such a dense urban area, we do have a lot more redundancy than you would typically have. And that's kind of reflected here. And we've actually had the luxury, because our service territory is so compact, that we have SCADA on every one of our network transformers. So we already had pretty close to grid edge. That's what I'm trying to show you here with this. We understood right up to the network transformer, not all the way to the customer, but for the last 30 years, what was happening dynamically on our system. And we've got very sophisticated load flow models. And that made sure that the electricity was there for the customer. We're one of the most reliable, if not the most reliable, companies in the world. We only interacted with them once a month for the bill because we felt that that was all they really wanted to interact with us. And of course, when there were outages, we wanted to get there and fix that. And in that world, asset management was key. There was a little bit of SCADA, and again, we were on the forefront of that, and a little bit of analytics. And the customer, again, was unfortunately almost an afterthought. Now, with rolling out our AMI, we're going to have a wireless network all the way to the customer. So as many as 30,000 points was a lot, but now we're going to have 3.3 million dynamic, almost real-time points and a wireless network over that. We're going to use that to add those sensors that I showed you, so infrared, pressure and temperature, et cetera, and so on. And facilitate, again, our customers, the whole reason we exist, whatever it is that they want to do and however it is that they want to communicate with us. So a customer engagement and transaction. And in this world, there's certainly still asset management, but there's much more SCADA and analytics, and the customer is king in this world. So to me, this is the distributed system platform and what we're trying to get to. And I see I got to wrap up the time. So under CLCPA, we're going to do just more of that. And we're going to not just concentrate on electric generation and some electric vehicles, but we're going to expand it all the way to heating. So whereas under REV, we were anticipating building less, under CLCPA, we're doing all the things we were doing in REV. We're still doing non-wire solutions, and we still anticipate we're going to be building a lot of traditional infrastructure of the future to meet our customers' goals. So DSP is critical to customer choice and resiliency, regardless of how the power gets greened. Large-scale renewables will be needed in certainly in New York City and New York State to drive that. Energy storage across the spectrum is critical, because no matter how you do it, whether it's offshore wind or onshore wind or solar, you're talking about very intermittent resources, and that energy storage has got to kind of be, that's the critical piece to make that work. Electrification is going to be a game changer, and it's probably even going to drive us from a summer peaking system where people are using air conditioning to a winter peaking one where the heating needs actually, and the heating needs and the electric vehicles actually exceed that summer load. And grid modernization, we think, is the glue that's going to hold that together. So with that, I'll wrap it up and turn it back to you, Jeff.
Great. Thank you so much, Damian. So we're going to take 3 or 4 minutes for questions here. I'm going to go to my, Damian, if you could stop sharing, actually.
Yes, I'd be happy to do that.
Actually, keep it up in case someone wants to go back to a slide. Sorry.
Okay,
well,
sure, no problem. We'll do.
So if you have a question, if you could hit your raised hand and I'll call on you, and if you can unmute yourself, that will be great. I'm looking through for hands at this point. I don't see any hands up. Damian, I'm going to ask you a couple until I see some hands pop up here. What type of price signaling are you doing within that network you have today? Because, I think what I've seen some of this, what's neat about what you have is that a lot of utilities haven't invested enough to actually see that power flow information within those circuits from substations to meters. And you even have it from transformers to meters, which is really impressive. But what type of price signaling are you using, and who's running in essence that retail market?
Yeah, there's a couple stages to it, right? So the AMI is almost completely rolled out. It'll be rolled out in I think the first quarter of 2022. So what the customers are getting as they get the AMI data is they're getting time of use pricing and where they might be able to save rates and things like that. So that's going to be one price signal that's sent across the board to everybody, and is going to be kind of tariff administered. Second place, we've got some very robust demand response programs where we pay what's effectively a capacity market. California is just an energy market. New York thinks more
capacity issue on a circuit, do you have any way to signal folks to take capacity on that circuit so you don't have to, balance further up the distribution system?
I mean, right now, the map kind of just tells them, hey, it's going to be less costly to interconnect here because we have a lot of hosting capacity and it's not going to be here. But we've been spending, well, we've started, this was the first year where we're going to spend about $14 million a year increasing the hosting capacity where we anticipate people are going to want to put their solar and are going to need to send backward flow on our system. So in both those ways, we're trying to kind of anticipate that.
Fantastic. We had a question in the chat box. And again, if folks, if you want to raise your hand to get called on, go down to participants, click it. There's a blue raise your hand sticker you can click on, and we'll know that you have a question if you want to ask it personally, or you can stick it in chat. The question in chat before we go on to the next speaker is, what's the process? I know in New York this has been driven by your commission, but in most states it'd be difficult to have a commission buy into these types of investments on their own. So there's a question in the chat about, how difficult has it been to, get these investments for Con Ed, I guess, basically into the rate base and approved.
Yeah. I mean, by nature, you want the process to be a little bit of a dynamic tension, right? But so within that framework, I would say it's been much easier when we've had compelling projects. So we literally call out the distributed system platform in our white papers, and the commission gave us something on the order of, I want to get you the right number, $107 million over the 3-year rate period to support what I was mentioning, increasing hosting capacity. I didn't talk about voltage VAR optimization, but facilitating voltage VAR optimization and doing some of these other things. They also supported us on our energy storage investments, which are in the actually over $30 million range. So you got to go in there and you got to justify it. New York State's given us a tool called the benefit cost analysis, where you can actually price carbon into it. So where that's made sense, we've tried to show the societal benefits to the investments we're making. And we feel like we've been very much supported and challenged to get to the right mix of investments. Thank you.
Fantastic. I don't see any more hands up. So Damien, thank you for sharing your expertise and really what's been one of the leading, I think, efforts to understand how new technologies are going to be integrated into the grid of the future. And, we really thank you for sharing your experience with this group here today. And we've had actually 4 or 5 of the Assembly energy chairs have come through this program over the years. I know Amy Palm was on our last webinar. So we've had good participation from New York because they've been trying to get their minds around what's going on with the work you're doing too. So thank you.
Thanks very much, Jeff.
Great. Hey, next up, we have Jessica Lau, who's the Senior Technical Project Manager for Grid Systems at the National Renewable Energy Lab in Golden, Colorado. And I'm going to introduce Jessica here for a second. Jessica joined our faculty for the first time, I think it was 2019, and she probably didn't realize it, but I think she was the consensus best new faculty member we added, to that cohort that went on. And I'm just looking to see if Jessica's going to pop up here on the screen, or if I think I saw her online.
Hey, Jeff, can you see me here?
Oh, there you are. I see you now. Good to see you. Hey, so Jessica is as I said, the Senior Technical Manager. She's been a power system planner for over 13 years. Her expertise and projects span reliability and resiliency planning, wholesale electricity markets, transmission and distribution grid modernization, and next generation modeling tool development. She is most interested in filling the gap between policy and implementation. She was a system planner at ISO New England, a distribution planning engineer at Orange and Rockland Utilities. She has a BS in electrical engineering and math, and a Master of Science in Power Systems Management. She really is one of the rock stars of distribution planning that we have in our national lab system, and we're lucky to have her expertise here with us today. Jessica, the floor is yours.
Great, thanks, Jeff. Hi, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon. Glad to be here today and happy to talk about the grid. As Jeff said, I've spent my career in power system planning, both at the transmission and the distribution side, so the wholesale and the retail side. And I think it's a really exciting area to be. I'm an engineer, so that also explains a lot, I suppose. Today coming to you from the National Renewable Energy Laboratory, we are working on advancing energy research and development, spanning from foundational science to discovery, invention of methods, components and energy delivery systems, and research and development, mainly in 4 different areas. First, renewable power, including solar, wind, water, geothermal energy technologies. Second, sustainable transportation, which includes bioenergy, vehicles, hydrogen technologies. Third, energy efficiency, including buildings technologies, advanced manufacturing research, and energy management programs. The fourth one, energy systems integration, where we apply hardware in the loop, simulations and emulations with high performance computing. And using data and visualizations, we can assess grid modernization strategies and ways to minimize disruptions to grid services from natural disasters or human attacks. So really exciting to be a part of NREL, coming from utility and ISO background. Next slide here. So all right, so let's talk about power system planning. Now, typically, I would start with 5 questions about power system planning. We first look at the system. We think about, does the system meet reliability and other criteria? And if it does or if it doesn't, does that mean we have to build something? So first we think about, what technologies do we build? Where do we build it? When do we need it and build it? And what will it cost? And so, using that as a primer today, because I think you understand that, is that we're going to move on and we're going to look at specific considerations to the distribution grid and distributed energy resources. You're going to find that I'm going to spend a lot of focus specifically on distributed energy resources, which sometimes I'm going to call DER as an acronym, because truly, I think the technology has created this evolution of why we're talking about distribution planning today and why we think it will be different in the future. All right, so let's kick off into, I'm going to frame this as 5 questions you should think about as you're considering distribution planning and in your work, how to think about this holistically. So I'm going to give some examples. I think you'll find that I have less answers than you may be looking for, but I'm hoping to give you a perspective of what are different stakeholders talking about in this space. All right, first question. What is a distributed energy resource? So key reason, right, why distribution planning is changing is because the emergence of the technology and the adoption of distributed energy resources. And so, even though we've talked about examples of it, right? Solar panels, combined heat and power systems, behind the meter batteries, electric vehicle batteries, demand response programs, lots of examples of DERs. But the key thing here of why this question sounds so basic, but so important we start out with, is that there is no universal definition of DERs. And so that in itself means that there is a huge opportunity for clarity, right? So when we look at different policy or legislation in different states, that definition is kind of flexible, if you will. It just depends on who you're talking about. Maybe a specific example would be a thermostat in someone's home. Some people would consider that as a DER, and some people wouldn't because it's a passive device. Maybe the customer is using it to turn on and off their AC depending on when they're home, right? So from a utility perspective, using as an example, they might say, well, I don't have any control over that, so it's not technically a utility DER because I can't control it. So one of the questions with DER sometimes is it fundamentally the technology itself that qualifies as a DER, or is it the function or the grid service it's providing that makes it qualify as a DER? So this is key when we talk about these different programs, is there is this line drawn between it. One of the recent events is FERC Order 2222. So it came out, was approved in September of this year. And so what it did was certainly move forward that clarity of DERs. It enables DER aggregators to compete in regional organized wholesale electricity markets. And it also provided that DER definition that I've provided on the slide there. Now, the key part of thinking about FERC, the FERC order, is that the jurisdiction ends, or the line is drawn when these DERs are interacting with the wholesale system, right? Transmission grid or the wholesale markets. What it doesn't address, or what, where the FERC jurisdiction ends, is if these DERs are purely on the distribution system and don't interact with the bulk system, then again, we kind of come back to my original point, which is what is a DER and what qualifies as that. So, in closing, in the first question, what I want to bring up here is that there's a huge opportunity to create the clarity of the definition of the DER, the ownership, looking at that, and also the responsibilities of performance, for example. Okay, second question. Now, the power system is designed and operated with multiple objectives. State and federal regulators have a mandate to ensure. Maybe you also have other policies, rental protection, transmission. So, but more, what we're seeing is that electric customers have questions and needs or asks related to their electricity, like the ones you're seeing on the slide here. And maybe you've heard some of these as well, or maybe you've heard of some of these as well. But ultimately, in the conversation of distribution planning and DERs, we would come to, are we looking at the technology or the function that it's performing, and what is the objective we're trying to achieve together? So some examples of proving out these objectives might be pilot programs. Typically, in the lifespan of the technology, you start with a pilot program that proves the functionality of it. So whether it's PV, batteries, or thermostat, you first do a pilot program that says, does it work the way we think it does? So it's purely on functionality. Then you might go into one objective. So you might think, well, I want to decrease our region's summer peak demand. And so maybe it's a thermostat program like we talked about before. So but one type of technology, one objective. And when we talk to different stakeholders through our work at NREL, what we're seeing is that they're ready for the next version of these pilot programs, which is multi-objective, multi-valued, and multi-technology. And so when we're looking at all these different asks and needs from our different electric consumers, the question is, how do we slowly might not be the right word, but I think thoughtfully evolve from new technology all the way to policy implementation. And certainly pilot programs are a key part of that. So in thinking of how to evolve that step by step is the key part of it. In driving back to what is the objective you're trying to achieve in your region, and how do you create these incentive mechanisms to drive through that? All right, third question. This is a prompt of a question, I suppose, is I'd like you to think about if you know anybody that has bought an electric car. And maybe think about if you talk to them, if they told you like the reason why they bought an electric car. I know a couple of people that have bought EVs, and usually we talk about like, hey, what make and model did you buy? Why did you buy it? How do you like it? Is it really different from driving a gas vehicle? And typically they say, oh, it's I bought it because it cost me a little less than gas, or hey, I bought it because it was cool. But you know what I've never heard someone say is I bought it so it could become a utility asset to be used for grid services. And so that's the third question I want to bring to you today is how do we align DERs with human behavior? Because a key part of DERs is inherently it serves multiple objectives. So every DER has its own primary objective why you bought it. So somebody might have bought solar panels for their house, right? Energy generation. EVs for transportation. HVAC equipment for cooling and heating their home or commercial site. A commercial industrial operation might have, production of their goods and services, right? And those primary purposes drive their adoption decision of why they got a DER. Now, on the flip side, when we talk about distribution planning or grid planning, the grid operator or the planner would like to use all the cost-effective, resources like DERs. If they're already on the system, say, well, hey, why wouldn't I use that to meet the grid's needs? But here's the conundrum, right? Utility customers would like to use DERs to meet their needs first, and only if there's leftover, they'll contribute to the grid. So if we use the thermostat example again, if I have a thermostat smart thermostat at home, sure, I'll let the utility control it, but only if my house stays cool in the summer or, it's heated warm in the winter. And then if there's anything extra, then the utility can use it. So, some people talk about economic incentives too, right? Like, can you pair economic incentives to change people's behaviors? Well, I think there certainly is a part or a place where economic incentives does play in it. But I think we can all agree to some degree, if you think of yourself in that thermostat example, there's some line you would draw like, oh, that's just too hot. I'm not going, I have to have the fans on, or I have to have the AC on, or, the winter, certainly heat is necessary for the cold. So there is certain line. So an example, like there was a study done for California. It's a 2025 California demand response potential study. They did some analysis of historical demand response programs and across all customer types. And what they decided was that they would not foresee, or let me put it this way, they think the maximum achievable participation rate is less than 40% across all customer types. So, clearly incentives help, right? Because people providing a service often do require payment. But the other part is there are fundamental behaviors about us humans that we're not going to change, even if there's a lot of economic incentive. Okay, so, but we should keep talking about payment because none of the technologies would be in existence if it wasn't paid. So it's a two-part question. First is, how does the technology itself, how should DER technologies be paid for? And the second part of the question is, how should grid services provided by that technology be paid for? So some examples of how it's done now. Example number one, utility-owned asset might be paid by utilities rate base. That could be a way that it's added on. Example number two is a privately owned asset is partially paid by end users, but also partially paid by utility incentives or rebates. So it's kind of a mixture. Sometimes a good example might be if you think about adding rooftop solar onto your house, like you can kind of go through. The first one is like utility completely owns it if they put on your roof. Second one is, hey, I kind of paid for most of it, but I get some incentive payments back from the utilities or rebates. The third one is just privately owned, privately owned. So whether by the customer themselves or maybe by the utility. So if it was me, I bought a solar panel, I own the whole thing. If I put it into the market, if there's a pathway for that, I get all the incentives back. So, these are three different examples about how DER resources are paid for. At least that's, where we are at this point. So there's a lot of different market mechanisms that could be structured to send the right economic signals. However, beyond the market mechanism itself, I'd like us to think about the business models that support it and that are needed. So I think if I give an example about a building owner and they're trying to decrease their energy use, right? So if they want a DER technology, whether solar panels, batteries, you name it, they could have it. They're going to need additional communications and control technology on their building. They're going to need an aggregator utility. And let's see. So the building owner, the DER technology, you need communications and controls. There's an aggregator you work with and a utility you work with, and possibly the last two are the same. But essentially why I'm naming those off is I just named 4 to 5 different business models that all have to be aligned for this whole thing to work. So it's not just the economic incentive mechanism itself, the structure itself, but it's also, are there business models out there, and frameworks that people are operating to connect this whole thing together, where at the end of the day, the consumer meets the objective that they need of why they bought the DER, all the way back to the grid planning of, hey, can we provide the grid services to the grid? So I think this is really interesting because sometimes we just say, hey, the money, if it pays enough, it'll do the job. But the reality is there's a lot of other barriers or possibilities for alignment along the way to help connect all these pieces together. Okay. All right, and last question, right? Really key one, right? Because policy and regulation certainly are key to appropriately valuing DERs. And I'd like to, give three examples here about how they're being done now. Now certainly DER technology development has been moving rapidly. Sometimes it's policy driven, and sometimes policy and regulation have been a champion for DERs. But again, in bringing up these ideas of like, hey, are people's business models evolving fast enough to meet this? Does the policy and regulation allow for business models to evolve to meet this? So, one example about how policy and regulation have a variety of impacts is in programs and funding. So policymakers can establish policies and programs to provide additional funding for DERs. For example, in California, the Electric Vehicle Infrastructure Project provided incentives to publicly accessible electric vehicle transportation infrastructure. And the revenue streams for policy initiatives like this can be sometimes hard to find, right? And in this case, for California, they used about 1.2 billion in revenue from the state's carbon cap and trade program to fund this low carbon transportation investments. So that's the Cal EVIP and that was over the past 5 years. So not just 1 year. So that's, one example about programs and funding. Second example is in compensation frameworks. Certainly I've brought this up already. Policymakers can require utilities to investigate how DERs can be compensated. So for example, like what Damien talked about in New York, they have the compensation framework, which is commonly referred to the value stack, or the value of distributed energy resources. In that framework, it goes beyond net metering. So it's not just about like what energy do you provide. It thinks about energy, capacity, environmental, demand reduction, and if like the location has a specific value, if it's more beneficial to be in that place, it also has like an adder. So, when you look at that value stack, it's certainly a different compensation framework to try to get at all these different objectives and values. And the last example I'll give, the third one, is participation in existing markets. So I brought up FERC Order 2222. That certainly opened up the doors for a lot of DER aggregators to participate in existing markets. But it all comes down to details, right? Prior to that, a lot of DERs, some were very successful and some struggled in entering the markets. There is a hot water heater control company that we had talked to, and it took them about a year working with an ISO PJM in order to enter the market. Just making sure that they hit all the requirements that the market sets on, whether it's financial obligations, the metering technology, and the way that it would provide information to the ISO as well. So anyway, so these are three different examples, I think, where policy and regulation play a key role in how DERs are valued and how they can participate. And again, all of these kind of come back to the 5 different questions that we talked about today. So in closing here, I want to bring up the future of distribution planning is an understanding the needs and wants of the electric consumers, the technologies we have available, and how those two things can merge together to create a balanced grid. And of course, we got to figure out how to pay for it. In that, the key piece is that policy and regulation plays a key role in all of this together. So I hope I gave you some thoughts, some things to think about today in terms of distribution planning and DERs, and thanks for your time.
Great, thank you so much for your expertise, Jessica. I'm taking a scan through for hands from anyone on the webinar. I don't see any. I'll ask one question, Jessica. I think one of the things I've seen that's been problematic, well, 2 things have been problematic. One is that there's a lot of siloed DER processes that go on that are focused on the technology and not the outcome people are looking for. And I think you kind of referenced it early in your deck about being conscious of what the outcomes are that you're trying to achieve. And where I'm going with this is that we see a lot of valuations for like EV on demand charging, for load following appliances, for microgrids, and they'll have different valuation structures. We're really on the circuits that Damien was talking about, that Con Ed has, the values and the outcomes being you're either providing capacity, taking capacity, or doing ancillary services on these circuits. And And I'm just wondering what you've seen, if you look at those regulatory proceedings, and are there white papers, documents you've all put out about the best approach to looking at DERs either collectively or individually, and what's the best pathway to take?
Yeah, I think that's kind of I guess the magic that everyone asks for is, hey, is there like an ideal integration roadmap? Has there been a success story we can kind of copy and paste? I think that's the most difficult thing about power system planning, is that every jurisdiction, region, town, city, everything is so dependent on the local territory. Whether you have rural, suburban, or urban customers, what kind of industrial, commercial processes you have, that the weight maybe between your residential and your INA customers, or your CNI customers, I meant, all of those come back to different structures. And I think that's truly why there is I think nobody's really come and be like, this is the answer, how we can deploy, DERs and have distribution planning, done 100%. It never has to change again. Is this truly, it's all very case dependent. I think there are fundamentals that we've talked about today, right? Like certainly keeping an eye on the objective you're trying to achieve first before you think about the technology, because truly solution, right? So the solution and try to meet your objective, figure out what you're trying to accomplish first, and then allow for the market to answer with the solutions. I think that has clearly been shown in many different cases to be a key piece of success there.
Fantastic. And again, I'll do one last scan for questions. If not, I'm going to try to get us a little bit back on schedule. And originally we had planned a microgrid, live microgrid tour at the end of this instead of the breakout discussions. And we did that for NARUC over the summer, and it ended up being an hour-and-a-half session. So we're actually rebooking that for January 5th. You all are going to get a placeholder for that live tour of Schneider Electric's R&D microgrid lab for January 5th. So we're going to talk about what you want to see in that experience during the breakout session. So we have a little bit of extra time to work with here today. Thank you, Jessica, so much for your expertise. It's always great to see you and hear your knowledge. We're going to move on to John Gibson, who's the director of the Innovation Lab and is the chief R&D engineer at Avista. I really wanted to get Avista in front of this group because they've really have done some innovative ways at looking at their system, about how their company was going to move forward in a sharing economy, which has been a really unique way to approach where it's going. I think Vista and maybe CPS, which is a publicly owned utility in San Antonio, where I know they've been looking at their motto's been is that if we don't treat each customer, if we're not each customer's energy consultant, we're going to lose them as a customer going forward. And that's, again, some of the best folks who are adapting to this change are looking through a different microscope at what's ahead of them. John has been the head of this effort for Avista for as long as I can remember. He's been a frequent speaker at the Pacific Northwest Economic Region summits and energy task force groups. At Avista, he leads the distribution services team and is currently developing Avista's first integrated and testing facility to certify inverters, the Internet of Technologies over open ADR communication, which is kind of cool too. His experience in the electric utility industry consists of hydroelectric safety, GIS facility management, which is location management for folks that don't know what GIS is, distribution planning and operations. He's a registered professional engineer in the state of Washington and has worked in the industry for over 25 years. He's a proud Gonzaga alumni and disappears during the March Madness frequently, and has a master's in engineering from Washington State University, just down the road from Spokane. John, thanks for sharing your expertise and knowledge with us. The floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much, Jeff. I appreciate that introduction. Both Damien and Jessica really did an excellent job setting the stage on some of the challenges around both the definition and the deployment of distributed energy resources. And I know at Avista, we've been experimenting in a lot of different ways to better serve our customers with their desire to have a more clean and renewable environment. So what I'll do today is, rather than just simply focusing on the broad platform that's necessary to deploy distributed energy resources, I'm going to focus in on a particular use case that we're doing. But before I do that, I want to kind of re-emphasize some of the points that were made earlier. Having some difficulty advancing the slide.
John, you could try clicking on your screen and using the arrow button.
There we go. Thank you. So just to give a little background, it was mentioned really about when we talk about utilities, you know, they're very different throughout the whole service across our country. And Avista Utilities is an investor-owned utility, and it's vertically integrated. It has power, it does production, transmission, and distribution. But we're relatively small. We have around 380,000 electric customers and about 350 natural gas customers, and we're located in the Pacific Northwest, but predominantly Eastern Washington and Northern Idaho. As a vertically integrated utility, we're also responsible for a balancing area. So we're obligated to balance load to generation. And rather than having a market, we have what's referred to as a bilateral market. So trades are essentially set up with long-term partners on a bilateral basis, and we don't have an open market that we're participating in. So all of those essentially define some type of operational constraint that we have to adhere to be successful in the deployment of products and services to our customers. So as mentioned earlier, you know, the challenge that we have to a large extent is that the regulatory model was built on a concept of centralized generational assets, often located hundreds of miles away from the load center, and orders of magnitude somewhere around 300 to 500 megawatts or greater. And the way that cost model has been handled to a large extent is it's been socialized. You essentially determine the cost of the production and the infrastructure to deliver it, and you socialize that cost across multiple customers. And that model is beneficial to someone who might live in Grangeville, Idaho, that's 300 miles away from a generational resource. Is the same cost for that retail energy as it would be to someone that's located right adjacent to that generational resource. So that socialized cost has been a very successful model in making energy affordable regardless of where you live. Now, what's unique about distributed energy resources is typically they're smaller in scale. They can be anywhere from 100 kW to about 2 megawatts. And once you reduce the scale of those resources, to be able to make them economically viable, you have to do many of the things that Jessica talked about. You have to look at stacking value streams on those distributed energy resources, and in order to ensure that you get an outcome. But the challenge to the utility is this. Often distributed energy resources, especially in the context of planning, are deployed to solve a localized problem, a specific constraint on the system. The question is, how would you develop a regulatory framework that would address a localized problem, but have a socialized outcome? And I'll talk a little bit about, within the experiment that we're doing in the Morris Center, how we're looking at trying to resolve that particular business model problem. So as I'd mentioned, scale really matters in these problem domains. Previously, I'd mentioned that these large generational facilities are located like in, for example, on the Clark Fork River system in the Pacific Northwest, and they're 300 to 500 megawatts, but our load center might be in downtown Spokane. So we have this large transmission system that essentially delivers energy. It wouldn't be all that uncommon for people who receive energy from the utility to have never seen those production resources. As I'd mentioned earlier, The benefit of that large economies of scale is that you can socialize those costs. And we have a production, transmission, and distribution cost that goes into our cost of service that essentially supports our rate case. And then it is allocated, that cost is allocated across various rate schedules, whether you're residential or a large customer. Depends on determines essentially what proportion of that overall system cost. And that is a significant political process. This is something that's been in place for a long time, and it essentially has been debated with various interest groups on how that cost would be allocated. And so it's very difficult to be able to unravel that. As I'd mentioned, in the previous diagram, I showed the region, that we would have these large production resources located out in the region, and we'd leverage the transmission and distribution resources or assets or infrastructure to deliver that energy. Now what we're talking about is something much more intimate or personal within the specific neighborhoods. So what you're looking at on this particular slide is, in the red circle is a substation. It's a Third and Hatch substation. It's located in Spokane, Washington. And this station currently has 9 distribution feeders. It's near capacity. And the colored lines that essentially reach out into the various neighborhoods, zones that you see there, are the feeders. And those feeders serve the load in that particular community. To address the constraints associated with that substation, you're now talking about addressing the idea of deploying distributed energy resources into people's neighborhoods. Consequently, you have a different level of planning required to support that. It's a different level of engagement. It drives a different type of relationship the utility needs to have with its customers to procure those resources and provide the branding that those neighborhoods want and the participation those neighborhoods want in order to address those issues. So just the fact that these distributed energy resources are smaller in scale changes the engagement model significantly for planning. So as I mentioned earlier, the significant challenge is we want to preserve the good things about the regulatory model. And one of them is this concept of socializing that cost. That essentially I can live in any parts of our service territory at Avista and have a similar rate to anyone else that might be located near the infrastructure like a substation. So how do we socialize that outcome even though we're doing things in specific neighborhoods? So to address that challenge, for example, on Third and Hatch substation, we deployed a project called the Eco District. And the Eco District today consists of 2 buildings. The first building, and you see in the forefront, is the gray building called the Morris Center. And on the first floor of the Morris Center is a deployment of what we call an energy plant. Or to simplify that, that's the heating, ventilation, and air condition, not only for the Morris Center, but for the building in the backdrop, which is called the Catalyst Building. It provides the conditioned environment to the Catalyst Building and will provide it for any building participating in the Eco District. The Catalyst Building is a building that's being deployed that is considered net zero, carbon free. It's a commercial space, 150,000 square foot of commercial space that has a particular brand that can attract the type of tenant, typically high technology companies, to be able to occupy that building. So the idea is the central plant will provide the conditioned environment to the Catalyst Building and any other building, up to 3 additional buildings in the Eco District. So what does that look like? And what is unique about that? At some level, that energy plant has an owner that has invested in that HVAC equipment to be operated and then provide the conditioned environment to the catalysts and other buildings in the eco district. But in addition, Avista Utilities has invested in equipment as well, predominantly around electric storage and a control framework that allows us to operate that energy plant for benefits associated with the grid. So just to repeat that quickly, the energy plant located in the Morris Center on the main floor provides the conditioned environment to multiple buildings, and it has a component of the technology and equipment owned by the utility to operate that environment that's beneficial to the grid. And by having a central plant, you can scale it and give it an operational flexibility, which is essential for distributed energy resources of thermal storage. And combining those components together, we have a new type of operational framework. So, as I'd mentioned, the existing regulatory framework we have in place was built and designed for centralized generational resources, delivering energy out to passive load. Today, by deploying distributed energy resources, we have to think about a new business model. And that business model has to be scalable across the country. So I'm going to show a couple ideas. Today, the way that the eco district is being implemented, there is a third-party operator, private entity operating it called EDO. And they are paying money to Spokane Eco District 1, a private owner of some of the mechanical equipment. Avista Utilities has made an investment in that equipment, but in return, it can schedule how those assets are deployed to ensure that there's a socialized benefit on the utilization of those assets by offsetting capacity. So when you look at this particular business model, another question comes up: how might it be differently? Well, one idea might be that the utility could own all of the equipment in the energy plant and could operate that equipment in a way that would be beneficial to the tenants, but provide an operational capability that's never existed before. Today, if you talk to power supply, the two complaints they make about distributed energy resources and demand response programs is essentially, one, they're not material, they're not at scale, and two, they're not dispatchable. Well, under this particular model, they become dispatchable, and you can schedule those assets to provide in a way that benefits the grid. And over time, these types of things will become material. The challenge is, if the utility invests in these assets and obtains a regulated rate of return on those assets, then you would argue, well, the rest of the customers are not necessarily benefiting from that. So one way to maybe do this is to essentially look at a smaller rate of return for these particular assets, but have a service model where EDO no longer pays Spokane Eco District, but pays Avista Utilities a service fee to leverage those assets. But that then is socialized over the rest of the customers to help offset the cost. So just different ideas around a particular business model. In some markets, due to a variety of different types of regulatory constraints that might exist around a public entity or around other regulatory markets, you might think of this as an aggregator, a third-party investment in these assets, and then they would operate it. The challenge is, in these types of developments, there's significant competition for capital. And investors in these types of facilities are looking for large rates of return in very short order. This business model works when it's fully built out and provides a good rate of return. But initially, it doesn't have a high enough return to attract capital to it, that what we're observing. So the challenge is, even though you may want to deploy these dispatchable load stations privately, it's hard to find someone who's willing to come in and deploy these types of projects because of the competition for capital. So those are the kind of bookmarks of this model, and they could be looked at in a variety of different ways. So if you start to think about what you're looking at here on your right is essentially the eco district. And if you look at what we do as a utility, we have substations outside our production resources. And we have substations that essentially transform our system from high voltage to lower voltage delivery systems. Well, we could also look at this drawing on the right as an eco district, or what we call a dispatchable load station. It has many of the components of a substation. It has transformation, control, and bus work. It has many of the elements associated with a substation. So under that context, that becomes an analog for the utility to think about these as dispatchable load stations. On the left is a project we're deploying further south in the U district, which is a microgrid. And as you can see, in some instances, resiliency becomes a significant issue, especially around hospital districts and some research done in universities. And this too looks like a substation. It has many of the components of a substation and can be controlled by the utility. And it becomes a resiliency station. So those are the analogs that we're looking at to think of new infrastructure that better serves the needs of the customers and drives us to a framework where the power supply group does not just simply schedule generational resources, but schedules load resources to meet that balancing obligation. So as you start to think about this neighborhood, the moment you step into someone's neighborhood, they have unique challenges and opportunities that they're facing. And you can't go in and deploy programs around power production without addressing that. You will find that you'll have to customize those programs to meet those specific neighborhood needs in order to get that stacked value stream and to ensure that you're serving the needs of your customers. The thing that's unique about this particular framework is that it's associated with a specific constraint. That third and hatch substation is near constraint. And rather than asking people what feeder they're on, we can correlate those feeders to neighborhoods. And then we can go out to the neighborhoods and architect programs that essentially help offset the capacity obligations on that station, but are crafted and personalized at a level that's meaningful to them, simply because of the scale of those types of programs. So that is, in summary, that is what Avista is doing. They are looking at a variety of regulatory frameworks and business models and different ways to think about energy to better serve the customers, some of it consisting of branding products as we put that out there. And as we explore that business model, we can then understand that as we look as a non-wire alternative distributed energy resource, is inherently a different solution than just simply a large centralized power production facility. So I'll stop there.
Great, John. Great overview. There's a couple websites that people can go to look at some of the innovation happening there in Spokane. I know of the Urbanova one. Are there other ones that folks should be aware of? You could share if they want to Google it, or maybe we can send the links out afterwards.
Yeah, I'll get you some links, Jeff, that will show what's going on in the eco district.
That's fantastic. And I'm going to scan through for hands right now for questions for John. I don't see any hands up. So what we're going to do is that we've got about 14 minutes left in our planned time together today. John, I don't know if you're still sharing your screen, but if you could go out of that mode, that would be great. Is that we're going to go to the group discussion phase. And if you want to turn your camera on, you can do that. If you don't, because you have bandwidth issues, you don't have to do that. If you want to change the view so you can see everyone, that's in that button's in the top right-hand corner. You can go to gallery view. But what we're going to have a discussion about a little bit is about what you all would like to see in a live tour of a microgrid lab coming up on January 5th. And Rep Handy, I see you on here. I see we have Assembly members Paul and Burke. Great to see you on here as well. You know what this discussion about is that we can tailor what you see, and I'll just describe what it is that we have an Andover building campus facility that's got a complete islandable microgrid. I think the utility is oh my gosh, I'm blanking out the utility name there, but National Grid is the utility for that facility up in Massachusetts, and we have a complete solar array, some storage, but there's also a backup generator involved that we can completely island off the facility and run 24/7 if we needed to. And what we do in the microgrid lab is they can actually do different things with that as far as implementing different software in the automation component and the machine learning part of it. I think one of the things that a lot of policymakers don't understand, it gets back to some of the things that Jessica was sharing and what I asked her, is that, you know, what goes into a building as far as a building energy management system and what runs a microgrid is exactly the same thing. There's no difference in it. It's just applied in different situations and called different things. But, you know, what these technologies do is they organize really within a building, within a certain geographic space, DERs behind a meter connection with the utility. And you know, there's all of them are usually proven technologies that are packaged together for that unique customer's needs. And what's lacking really is a way for those customers to interact with the utility in an organized way. And that's what New York was trying to do with what you heard from Damien and the REV process that they're working with. You know, Jessica shared some of the questions that should be asked when trying to figure out this path forward. And there is a silver bullet report out there that shows you exactly the way to take. But the transition's happening, and customers, like we saw back with the early adoption of technology, and Damien mentioned Moore's Law quite a bit. You know, Moore's Law is coming to the energy sector to a certain extent, and you know, change is going to happen driven by customers faster than government and regulations can keep up. And that's, I think, the thing that we've seen over and over again in the marketplace is, you know, once something happens, I could show it to this group now, but, you know, some of the home energy management systems, the way they're going to work is basically you're going to have a microgrid small platform that drops right into the fuse box, and you're going to be able to set your values on your phone. And with internet edge devices that it can communicate with, I think in our view, you know, if the communication ports are there, it can be the heat pumps, the hot water systems, the refrigeration units, the EV charging, can all be optimized for whatever the values are for that customer behind the meter, and then also interacted with the utility within a value spectrum that's really set and forget. And, you know, when I talk about the smart grid to my local Kiwanis clubs, and Steve, you probably have had this experience in Utah, you know, you need to put this in terms that your constituents can understand. And I always say, hey, you know, if you want to know what the smart grid is, every time you buy something, you're buying something that's going to help you bring your values to the grid versus the grid bringing its values to you over time. And that's what's happening before our eyes today. So Steve, just because I can see that you're actually there. Thanks for turning your camera on.
Yeah.
You know, what would you want to see in an interactive tour? What you're going to have is our Chief Technology Officer at Schneider, showing you how the microgrid works. He'll be able to do some different scenarios about how the microgrid interacts with the utility, and then but you'll be able to do live questions and answers with him as he's doing it. I mean, what would you want to get from a session like that would be of value to you?
Yeah, terrific. Thanks, Jeff. I think that what I'd like to see is other than what you have described us now, is what are the customer service ramifications? How does a customer interact back, and how do they respond to a customer if a customer has some technical problems or something like that? But I think that you know, in with the limitations of the way we'd have to see this virtually, I guess we're going to just do the best we can. I don't know.
Yeah, we did it for neighborhood and it worked out pretty well because we're going to have a stand-up camera. So it's like a live news interview,
Okay.
except you're the interviewer. And you'll be able to ask questions kind of on the fly and so forth. But, I guess, would you be interested in seeing the outside solar array in the parking lot, or was just the internal lab part good enough for you, do you think?
I just think I just think maybe a quick shot. Here's the solar thing. We don't need to go through it too much. We've seen a lot of those. But here's how it's integrated and here's how it works within the building. I think that'd be more interesting to me.
Right. And I see Stan and Amy, Autumn, Matt, do you have any thoughts about what you'd like to see in that tour?
Hi, Jeff, it's Autumn. For us here in California, I think our real struggle is kind of understanding the interaction with utilities. So, everything that we could see that helps us understand what that looks like in practicality and how other people, I know there's no silver bullet, but what that's looking like on this project.
I agree. Yeah, sorry, it's Amy. I totally agree with that. Yeah. Honestly, all of it is helpful. So you take little pieces and they help you with something.
Yeah, fantastic. And I just want to drill down on this a little bit. So is it more important in your mind to understand the how you're going to interact? I think that's really the, billion-dollar question, to quote Jessica, or the whatever, however Jessica put it. It is, what is the platform of which you interact around with the utility? But is that more important to understand that than the business models that are being exercised? And with the home energy management systems, those are pretty small, and they're going to be adopted without probably a lot of weird business models, other than people buying them as part of their solar system they may buy for their house. But for some of the larger systems, there's energy as a service. There's all sorts of different business models that are popping up behind the meter. And I think what's kind of a struggle sometimes too is that it's a pretty competitive market behind the meter, there's not a lot of clarity about where like the utility law stops and consumer protection law really picks up, right?
So, Jeff, when you say business models, I guess models that utilities can facilitate a particular model.
Yeah, I think it's really you asked the right question, and those questions are both accurate. So I'll use JFK as an example. I know we're doing a complete microgrid for JFK Terminal 1, and we're rebuilding the entire terminal. We're doing the microgrid, we're doing the EV charging, the CHP system, and we're taking all the CapEx risk, all the capital investment. We're doing all the technology risk because the airport doesn't want to own that, right? And we have a power purchase agreement with them where we send them a bill every month, just like the utility does. In a lot of states, you wouldn't be able to do that because you would have to be regulated as a utility at that point. That's an example of one business model that is being adopted and used in places like New York that has some of this sorted out, versus other places where there's a lot of laws left over from the 1950s that kind of keep some of these innovation things from coming out. California is a good example, and I know a lot of discussions we're having there is that, hey, it's great that the state is supporting building a microgrid around a fire station, but the question is, how do you scale to 100 fire stations or 1,000 fire stations?
Then for me, honestly, the business model piece is probably the most interesting and helpful, because I get it. Yeah.
Great. So go ahead.
Just to kind of piggyback on what you just said, yeah, we're struggling. We don't even have a definition really between a microgrid and an investor-owned utility. We kind of still are fuzzy even in some of those areas in our laws. So to see the business models that could be coming down the pike for us would be super helpful. I think as we as we start to actually put together an actual definition of microgrids, which I think will start this year with all of our wildfire conversations. So I think the business model, but obviously in California, we can't exist that business model, how it integrates with that utilities is something that's hard to avoid.
Fantastic. That's great feedback. So what we'll do is we'll do a good amount of time around business models along with the actual microgrid tour. So it's not just a microgrid tour and a lab interactive piece, but we'll also have a session talking about some of the different business models we're seeing not only in the US, but elsewhere that are helping folks get, again, bring whatever values they have. So those values are different. I think, Damien said that in his presentation that, different, and John did too, someone may value resiliency over price, right? There's all sorts of different value structures out there that different business models can deliver. Hey, we got about 3 minutes left. And so I want to see if anyone has any, talk about anything in your jurisdiction that's really working out well in this space or that you feel confident about. If you have any questions for our experts who are still with us here on this call, I just want to see if there's anything folks want to share, as far as good policy practices you're seeing, things that you wish we would spend more time on. And we are trying to provide these deeper dives into some of these topics to kind of add on to what you got previously when you joined the Energy Institute. So any comments or questions?
Not related to resiliency, although I'm very interested, obviously, in that. But New York is moving toward, or trying to move toward, very aggressively a renewable grid, and so I've recently introduced a carbon pricing bill, working with our NISO, and I know that you guys probably have much more access to what's happening out there. I mean, our NISO is claiming that, we're uniquely positioned because New York's ISO is solely dedicated to New York. So we're uniquely positioned to do something like this. But I would just love to know, I know that there's a California initiative and others, and, as we move forward, because I'm going to be very aggressive in pushing this bill, just what else should we be considering and what else is out there? And we have a lot of people on board, from the power producers to the environmentalists, but I just know I don't know everything, and I would love to know more. So I throw that out as a future help, at least for, and I think for probably everybody.
Yep. No, thanks so much for that. That gives us great guidance on what we're providing for content in the next sessions. Any other comments or questions? Well, we really value your time and wanting to learn more about these subjects as always. So there is a session tomorrow. Yvonne, anyone want to jump in with the time just to remind folks?
At 10 a.m. Pacific time to 11:30.
If you can't make it, we are recording these. Is there going to be an evaluation at the end as well?
Yes, and today's evaluation is available.
Is it in the chat box?
Yes.
All right, so there's a link in the chat box to do the evaluation for this session to give us more feedback. If you know folks that would benefit from going through LEHI, we still have a few slots left for the 2021 class. So please let folks know, get a hold of Glenn, Christy, Matt, Yvonne, send the names to us and we'll make sure that they get into the process. Thanks for your time. Thanks to our great speakers today. Let's give them all a virtual applause. If you can't find the button, you can just give them a thumbs up in your thing. But hey, thank you so much, John, Damien, Jessica. It's always great to get people with actual knowledge on these calls. So thank you for sharing that with us. All right. Hey, everyone, be safe, be well out there. And thanks for sharing your time with us.
Thanks, everybody.